Hello everyone, welcome back to Archaeology Tube. I'm your host, Dr. Bill Farley, back here again today to talk about some cool archaeology. I thought I'd do something a little bit different today, something I haven't done before, but I kind of want to do a lot in the future, which is sort of a mini run-through of an exciting new find in archaeology. Maybe it's a new journal article that's just come out about a site that's brand new or something we've known about for a little while, or maybe it's a look at some site that maybe you've never heard of at all. Today I'm going to be talking about something that's been in the news a little bit lately. It is a relief found at the site of Sayburç, which is in Turkey, in the same region as sites like Göbekli Tepe, near the Euphrates River. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through this academic journal article that came out in the journal Antiquity. It was just published a few days ago, and it was written by Eylem Özdog. I'll apologize now, I probably am saying that a little bit wrong. So this is not a new archaeological site. It's been excavated for a long time, but this was a look at a particularly exciting and fascinating part of the site, a group bench in a communal area that includes the relief of 5 figures, 2 human figures and some animals. The site of Sayburç is around 11,000 years old, and it comes from this really miraculously exciting time in the history of that region, that transition to settled life that we call the pre-pottery Neolithic. Obviously, other sites that have been written about and spoken about a lot, especially recently, like the site of Göbekli Tepe and the site of Karen Tepe, which are both located nearby, all come from seemingly the same sort of cultural tradition, whether this is all a single monoculture across a pretty wide space, or if this is just cultures that are closely related and probably have some sort of a shared history. I don't think we know for sure. There's probably some theories about that. But as I was saying before, this transition into the pre-pottery Neolithic and so-called settled life is such an exciting time in archaeological history because it's a period when we see people starting to express themselves more symbolically, at least in ways that last until today that we can find them as archaeologists. It's certainly possible people have been doing similar sorts of artworks in earlier time periods, but they might not be on pieces that preserve as well as reliefs carved into stone like these ones. And so we really want to bring our attention to sites like this because they speak to this communication through art, the creation of social meaning, the creation of perhaps cultural identity through the expression of symbols within art. I'll talk more about that a little bit later when we get into the symbol and the interpretation of this site. So let's start by describing this particular scene that's laid out on this stone bench. So it's actually 2 scenes that appear to be related and are arranged in a horizontal telling, perhaps, of a story. Whether they're meant to be read from the left to the right or the right to the left, I'm not actually sure, and they're not saying inside the paper. Now, scene 1 here has a human figure who is very clearly holding their phallus. Now, this is sort of a funny thing to think about looking at this from the past, and many hilarious jokes have already been made on Twitter and elsewhere about this scene, but we should know that representations of the human phallus are pretty common in ancient art from around the world, and certainly within this region, and the phallus and its representation in a scene like this seems to have a lot of potential symbolic meaning. Surrounding this human figure are 2 leopards, and these leopards have, they appear to be quite dangerous. Their fangs are bared. We can see them in a threatening pose. They seem to be threatening by our human figure who's at the center of this scene. Now, one of those 2 leopards has a phallus that we can see and the other does not. So again, we see a continuation of that theme here. In scene 2, we have another human figure, again with a phallus, though not holding it. This one has some interesting features. On one hand, we can see that the figure has 6 fingers, which is certainly strange, and be curious to see what the interpretation of that turns out to be with time. And also is holding an object, perhaps a snake or a rattle. At least that's what Özdog infers in their paper. Now, the second figure in this scene is a bull, shown in a mixed perspective. So we can see it both from the side and above, sort of at the same time, which is a not uncommon way to represent animals during the Neolithic in the Near East or Southwest Asia, like in places like Turkey. Found it. I wanted to bring the article back up so that I could read something to you in just a second. Now, the Sayburç Reliefs have some recurring themes in them, things that we see elsewhere in the region. Those include, for instance, human-animal relationships. We can see this at sites like Göbekli Tepe and Çatalhöyük and others, simply representations of humans interacting with animals. Obviously, this is a common theme in lots of even Paleolithic art, if not Neolithic art, in many parts of the world. People's relationships to nature and to the environment and to animals within that environment are always important to human experience, frankly, even today, but certainly in antiquity. The clothing that's seen in this depiction on one of the figures represents something that looks very similar to something on one of the pillars at Göbekli Tepe. At least that's what Özdog points out in the paper. Now, what's different about this piece is, of course, this narrative nature of it, this narrative depiction, this almost a graphic novel-like, comic book-like sort of setup where we have the two related scenes that seem to tell a two-part story. Now, what is that story? What is that story trying to tell? It's impossible to know, frankly, as archaeologists. We can make interpretive guesses. We can figure it out to some extent, based on relationships with this symbolism as shown in other depictions and other sites in the region. But to some extent, this obviously has a lot of symbolic meaning in it. So trying to understand that without going back in time into people's minds is frankly impossible. We do our best with it, but we can never know for sure. So I actually wanted to just take a second and read the last few sentences of the paper so that we could unpack them a little bit. So I'm going to look away from the screen for just a moment to do this. So it says here, and this is a quote from the final page of the paper, "The figures were undoubtedly characters worthy of description. The fact that they are depicted together in a progressing scene, however, suggests that one or more related events or stories are being told. In oral traditions, stories, rituals, and strong symbolic elements form the foundation of the ideologies that shape society beyond spirituality." Schmidt interpreted Göbekli Tepe with its powerful symbols as a new connection point for memory in a changing world. The Sayburç Reliefs, then, can be seen in a similar light, the reflection of a collective memory that kept the value of its community alive. So let me unpack that for a couple seconds for you, because I imagine if somebody's just coming off the street and reading this article trying to learn about this, they might not understand what's happening in this section, because you need to be like a little bit buried in archaeological theory to know, I think, what the author here is trying to say. Connecting, he's trying to make frankly, a quite limited interpretive statement here about what these reliefs might have meant to people in the past. And more importantly, what they might tell us about how humans interact with symbols and artistic representations like these ones, right? Because ultimately we're interested in that, right? We want to know, what is the human universal here? What can we learn about humanity in general? What can we perhaps learn about ourselves by looking at a site like this? Always a fascinating thing to do as an archaeologist. And so this brings me back to other writings from Schmidt, as referenced here, or Ian Hodder, their arguments being that people came together in the Neolithic before the emergence of agriculture, before there were large-scale economic pressures like the adoption of agricultural practices and state-sized societies and urbanizations, big urban centers, huge population densities. Before any of that stuff came, these scholars are arguing came symbols, came shared language of certainly words, perhaps proto-written languages, but certainly symbols like the ones we see repeated again and again in sites throughout this region. And so they're pointing to the bowl, the phallus, the way the humans are represented here, the clothing of the human figures, the representation and orientation of the bowls, the space and size of the different figures as they relate to each other. These are laden symbols. They are things that would have had meaning to people in the past. And that shared understanding of cultural meaning is actually supported people coming together to create sites like this, to create sites like Göbekli, without the economic pressure to do so. So you didn't need to get together to build the pyramids. You didn't need to get together to sow fields. You simply got together because there were cultural, symbolic connections between you and your kinsmen, your group around a region. And so perhaps these sites were those collection points, and that actually those economic factors, the urbanization and the agriculture and such, may have come afterwards, may have come actually to support that symbolic and cultural communication, not the other way around, which is a real flip on its head of what archaeologists used to think maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago, right? So the archaeologists have been developing these ideas now for quite a while, but this is an exciting new bit of evidence. All right, everyone, thanks for coming on this little journey with me and exploring this really really cool site. I'll put a link to the paper, which is open access. Actually, anybody can see it for free right now, which is fantastic. And give it a read. It's quite short. It's really only a few pages long. There's some great images in there, which you've seen scattered throughout this video. Give that a look. Read a little bit more about this article. And of course, like this, leave a comment. Tell me what you think about the findings at Sayburç and some of the similar sites nearby. And make sure you subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.